everyone, welcome back to another cult movie review with me, Bo, here on the Film Scene Investigation channel. Thanks so much for checking out the review. In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing the controversial 1976 movie SS Experiment Camp. Before we get into it, guys, if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. All the support is greatly appreciated. So, SS Experiment Camp from 1976 was this Nazi exploitation film directed by the Italian filmmaker Sergio Garon. Over the years, the movie became notorious for its brutal depiction of prison life and was subsequently banned here in the UK for some time. Now, I first came across this film back in the early 2000s. I had read an article where it listed the 20 most controversial horror films of all time, and SS Experiment Camp was one of them. At the time, I wasn't too aware of the whole Nazi exploitation genre, and the idea of a film depicting such events seemed kind of messed up. Of course, a film like this was never broadcast on TV, nor did I ever see it in my local video store. There was one time I remember I was on a day trip and I went into this VHS store and I actually saw the film on the shelf. I remember there being this huge swastika on the front cover, and I thought, yeah, there's no way I'm going to buy that. So yes, it was many years before I finally sat down to watch this bleak World War II drama. So when it comes to the film's narrative, it began with a pretty depressing torture scene that saw a young woman strapped to a chair. She had some sort of electromagnetic energy being zapped into her while the doctors just stood around and monitored the results. Very quickly, it became clear that this woman was a prisoner of war, acting like a guinea pig for the SS army to conduct their experiments on. With all the screams and the panic, it made for a very chilling introduction that gave the audience a clear indication of what the film entailed. And while SS Experiment Camp did feature several scenes of torture, interestingly, there was a fairly compelling story underlining it all. We were introduced to the character Dr. Steiner, who was played by actor Attilio Dotesio. He was a very experienced surgeon tasked to carry out all the experiments on the prisoners. He was constantly at odds with his superior, the man in charge, Colonel Climax, who was played by actor Giorgio Cerrone. The Colonel kept pushing this insane idea of an ovary transplant, even though Dr. Steiner kept telling him that it was practically impossible. Many innocent women died in these failed attempts, but the Colonel just didn't care. He just wanted results. Steiner thought the whole thing was completely mad, a worthless sacrifice, yet the Colonel just continued on giving him orders. The doctor had a secret affiliation with the Jewish people, and the Colonel knew this, so he decided to blackmail the doctor into carrying out the experiments. A secret like that coming to light would have no doubt put Dr. Steiner's life in jeopardy, so he continued on following the orders. But Colonel Climax wasn't just interested in ovaries. He actually wanted Dr. Steiner to carry out a testicle transplant on himself. Now, seeing the Colonel make this request did seem kind of ridiculous at the time, but then we found out his backstory. We would discover that the Colonel had actually been castrated by a Russian girl he had taken hostage some years ago. After the attack, the Colonel struggled to continue on with his day-to-day duties, knowing that he had lost his manhood and he could no longer conceive children. The castration affected him deeply and, in a way, made him even more ruthless in his quest to find a solution. As time went on, the Colonel found a soldier called Helmet who he wanted to use for the transplant. The soldier, who was played by actor Mircea Carvin, wasn't told the full story behind what was going on. The Colonel pretended that it was all part of this bigger military operation and that he didn't really need to know any further details. Even though Helmet was a SS army soldier, I felt kind of bad for him since he didn't know what he was getting himself into. He's thinking that he's, doing his duty for the country, and in actual fact, all this was down to the Colonel's own doing. I mean, the resources at the camp were there for experimentation on the prisoners, not for personal or private use. Surprisingly, the transplant ended up being successful, with Helmet later on finding out what had happened to him. There was a scene where we saw Helmet try to make love to one of the prisoners, but simply couldn't go through with it, then suddenly realizing he himself had been castrated. The soldier, quite rightly, was in complete shock at what happened to him and wanted answers, so he decided to confront Dr. Steiner. The doctor, who was already guilt-ridden over his own actions, was then forced to tell Helmet exactly what had happened and why. The soldier had been lied to, and he found it extremely difficult to comprehend the fact that his own people, the side he was fighting for, would betray him like that. After Helmet found out what had actually happened, he went berserk and grabbed another officer's gun and started shooting, which led to an all-out bloodbath. We saw the soldier rush into these private quarters where he confronted the Colonel at gunpoint. While the Colonel stressed that the transplant could indeed be reversed, Helmet wasn't buying any of it. Helmet had enough of the lies. He wanted payback, he wanted blood, but interestingly, instead of him killing the Colonel at point blank, he allowed the prisoners to take their revenge instead. The final moments of the movie saw Helmet and a fellow prisoner, his love interest, try to escape the camp. With all the sirens and alarms going off and all these spotlights flashing, it was near impossible not to be seen. Both Helmet and the prisoner tried their best to escape, but ultimately were killed by the other officers. Seeing Helmet and the prisoner shot and killed was a very depressing and bleak end to a very brutal film. SS Experiment Camp was a slow burn, but the final 15 minutes with the reveal and the shootout really made the film. Initially, I was led to believe that the movie was just a series of experimental torture scenes, but in actuality, once the Colonel's story came to light, I became a lot more invested. Now, I want to give some credit to the actor Attilio Detesio for his performance as Dr. Steiner. I thought Detesio was excellent as the guilt-ridden doctor trapped in this world of misery. Even though the doctor was carrying out some brutal experiments, he knew deep down it was wrong and he wanted out. The actor used his eyes to convey the despair the character felt. There was this really deep sadness that loomed over Steiner, which actually led him to commit suicide at the end of the film. Indeed, it was a sad way to go, but knowing the doctor's anguish that he carried, the suicide could be looked on as the doctor's only real solution. I mean, let's face it, he was trapped, he was getting blackmailed by the Colonel, and it was just a matter of time before people would find out his true affiliation to the Jewish people. The actor gave a very strong but reserved performance, which sadly got overshadowed by the savage brutality we saw on screen. One scene I want to bring up is the sequence with the runaway prisoner. So after one of the orgies had taken place, one of the sex slaves, this blonde-haired woman, picked up a fork from the floor and started stabbing the sergeant multiple times in his chest. The sergeant, who was played by actor Serafino Perfumo, was completely caught off guard and couldn't defend himself. This woman, this prisoner, was completely unhinged. I mean, she'd just been sexually assaulted multiple times, so yeah, it kind of made sense that she was acting out like she did. But the girl made the mistake of not finishing off the job, and instead, after stabbing the sergeant a few times, decided to run and make an escape. She ran outside, completely naked, screaming. Of course, all eyes were on her, and she was immediately spotted and shot by one of the officers. The sergeant then came stumbling by, with blood still dripping from his wounds. He was rightly furious and embarrassed about what had happened to him, and decided to send a brutal message to the rest of the prisoners, making sure they never tried to do the same thing. The girl was then hung upside down and left to endure this slow and painful death while all the other prisoners looked on. Not only was this a cruel act of torture, but it was also a mental blow for the other prisoners who still had hope that they would one day escape. I hated seeing it all, but I will say credit to the filmmakers because, they definitely got the point across that these soldiers were complete savages. Now I need to take a moment and give some credit to the movie's set designers for their impressive efforts. From the science labs to the elegant dining rooms, the film had this very authentic feel that helped engross the audience further into the story. While many may disagree with the controversial narrative, I don't think anyone can deny that this movie certainly looked the part. Nothing looked cheap, and it was clear that the filmmakers went to great lengths to recreate this wartime aesthetic that I really appreciated. It should be noted that SS Experiment Camp was of course a fictional story, but based on historical events. There were a number of creative liberties taken which resulted in a more sensationalized view of the prison camps. It could be argued that this movie and movies like SS Experiment Camp dabble in what could be described as historical sensationalism. And what I mean by that is exaggerating the facts to manipulate the narrative. Whenever I see depictions like this, I always tend to take everything with a pinch of salt, and I would advise the viewers to also do the same. And so, dislikes for SS Experiment Camp from 1976. My biggest dislike for the film would have to be the romantic subplot involving Helmet and the blonde-haired prisoner. So in the film, we saw Helmet take a shine to one of the prisoners, which later blossomed into a romance. Given the risk involved, the two kept quiet about the relationship, not letting anyone know about their secret. Now, having this love story subplot definitely added a layer of melodrama to an otherwise grim narrative. Having the subplot did give the audience a chance to catch their breath and get away from the various torture sequences. But overall, I just found the relationship to be very one-dimensional and insignificant in comparison to the rest of the film. I also found it hard to determine whether the prisoner actually loved Helmet or she was just using him as a possible escape route. That idea could have been an interesting twist, but none of that was ever fleshed out. Ultimately, I would have removed all of the romance from the film and maybe inserted more scenes with Dr. Steiner, as he was a way more interesting character. And so, ratings for SS Experiment Camp from 1976. I'm going to be rating this movie a 4 out of 10. With all the blood and the guts, I have to say that I found SS Experiment Camp to be a rather somber experience. Yes, the lingering violence and abuse was a lot to handle, but past that, there was a very intriguing story about a doctor losing his sanity bit by bit. And yeah, it does seem a bit weird to say, but I actually did enjoy SS Experiment Camp a lot more than I thought I would. And I think that was down to the fact that I went into this with pretty low expectations. From what I read in the past and from what I'd seen online, I really kind of was led to believe that this was some sort of softcore exploitation flick. And while some people may still see it that way, I kind of thought that SS Experiment Camp had a lot more to offer. The Doctor's story in particular maintained my interest throughout, up until the very end when the character made his poignant exit. While not to everyone's tastes, SS Experiment Camp remains an intriguing piece of cinema that illustrated the extremes of the exploitation genre rather than give an accurate representation of World War II events. If any of you guys watching have seen this movie, please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. For all those who haven't, yeah, I would recommend it loosely, but be prepared. If you're quite easily offended, then this is definitely not the film for you. Well, that's all from me today, guys. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll be back next week with another cult movie review. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, take care.